This is my true story. I raised my son alone after his mother died. I gave him everything, my time, my savings, even the land my father left me. But the day he slapped me in front of his wife was the day I stopped being his father in my heart. I never thought my own blood would humiliate me like that. I didn't argue. I didn't cry in front of them. But I made a decision that night that would change his life forever. Before I tell you what I did next, tell me where you're watching from. And please subscribe so my story can reach more people like me. I worked in construction my whole life. I learned the trade from my father, and he learned it from his. I started as a helper who carried sand in buckets and swept concrete dust at sunset. I ended up as the man people called when a foundation had to be perfect, when a beam had to be straight, when a roof had to stand through storms. My hands stayed rough for 40 years. My back stayed sore, but my heart stayed steady because I believed in building things that last. I built houses for strangers. I repaired schools after floods. I patched temple steps so old people would not slip. I worked through heat, rain, and winter wind. I missed holidays. I missed sleep. I did not miss a bill. Every month, I put a little aside, not for luxury, not for travel, for my son. When his mother died, I promised 2 things. First, he would never go hungry. Second, he would stand on ground that belonged to him. We owned a piece of land on the edge of town. It was not the biggest plot, but it was good land, high enough to avoid water, close enough to the road to reach the market. Strong soil. My father gave it to me with one sentence: keep this for the family. I kept it safe for decades. People came with offers. I said no. Developers wanted to level it and pour quick money on it. I said no. I paid the taxes on time. I cleaned the boundary walls myself. I planted neem and mango saplings along the border so there would be shade one day. I told my son, this land will be your future. He grew up playing on that plot. He ran toy trucks over the mounds of dirt while I measured corners with string and pins. He chased kites under that blue sky while I checked the slope for drainage. I taught him small things first: how to tie rebar with wire, how to use a plumb line, how to read a simple site plan. He was not always patient, but I kept showing him. I told him that good work is slow and careful. I told him that a house is not a picture on a phone. It is a promise you keep with a family. When he got older, he chose office work. I respected his choice. I did not force him into the trade. I told him, your work is your work. My work is to have your back. I paid for his schooling as far as he would go. I bought him a used scooter so he could get to his first job. I fixed it myself when it made that rattling sound. When he said he wanted to get married, I felt proud. I met the girl and her family. I welcomed them warmly. I paid for the wedding hall. I paid the caterer. I did not keep receipts to throw in his face later. I did it because fathers do that when they can. As a wedding gift, I gave him the land. Not in a loud speech, not to impress anyone. I took him there one evening when the light was soft and the soil smelled alive. I walked the boundary with him. I told him what my father told me. Keep this for the family. He hugged me. He said he would. I believed him. We talked about a house. Not a big one, a strong one. A home with room to grow. A place where a child could take first steps and grandparents could sit in the shade. We stood there a long time and watched the sky turn orange. He wanted to start building soon. I said yes. I helped him find a good architect who does not draw foolish shapes that leak when the first rain comes. We planned a simple, honest house. 2 floors, 2 bedrooms upstairs, 1 bedroom downstairs for old age, a kitchen that opens to light, a small veranda, and a water tank high enough to never run dry. We measured and marked. I brought my old crew for the foundation because I trust their hands. I was on site every morning at dawn. I checked the string lines. I checked the pit depths. I checked the mix ratio. I carried sacks when the young boys got tired. My son came sometimes before office, coffee in hand, looking proud. His wife came once or twice and took photos. I smiled at them both and said, soon you will have your own keys. We poured the foundation on a Sunday. I said a small prayer before the first batch went in. Let this house stand through storms. Let this house collect laughter. Let this house never hear cruel words. I set a coin from my father under the first corner. My son watched me do it. I told him why. He nodded. We smoothed the surface. We cured it with water every day. When the first column rose, I held his shoulder and said, "Look, this is your future standing up." He laughed like a boy. That sound made all the aches worth it. I did not stop at the foundation. I helped lay block. I checked the lintel shuttering. I argued with a supplier who tried to send us broken tiles. I taught my son how to spot a hairline crack and when to reject a delivery. We made a rule together. If it is not good enough for us, it is not good enough for our house. When the roof went on, we stood up there in the evening breeze. The town looked small. The trees we planted years ago wrapped the boundary like a promise kept. He put his arm around my shoulder. "Thank you, Dad," he said. That night, I slept like a stone. When the house finished, I paid the final bills that he could not cover. I did not make a noise about it. I bought them a sturdy dining table because meals should be shared on something that does not wobble. I hung a ceiling fan in the spare room myself. I fixed a small leak around the balcony drain and said nothing to avoid worry. I planted 2 more neem trees by the gate. I gave them a set of tools and told him, "A man should know his own house." He said he would learn. I believed him again. I imagined that house as a place of unity. I imagined birthdays with candles and laughter. I imagined festivals with lights along the railing and sweets in tins. I imagined myself sitting on the veranda while a grandchild ran circles around a chair. I imagined my son leaning in the doorway with pride, his wife bringing tea, and all of us breathing the same quiet air. I imagined that when I got very old, there would be a bed near a window where I could watch the neem leaves move and hear morning birds. I imagined that my last years would be surrounded by the thing I built with my hands and the people I loved with my whole life. Because that is what the land meant to me. It was not dirt, it was history, it was duty, it was love pressed into soil and watered for decades. It was my father's voice still walking the boundary with me. It was my son's laughter on the roof at dusk. It was a line from the past to the future. I believed that line would never break. I believed my son would guard it the way I did. I believed respect would live inside those walls like air. So when I gave him that land, I did not think I was losing anything. I thought I was completing a circle. A father lifts a son. A son lifts his own family. The land holds them both. That is what I believed, and I held that belief like a warm stone in my chest. I did not know that one day those same hands that tied rebar and poured concrete for his foundation would rise to my face in front of his wife. I did not know that a house I helped stand up would be the room where my pride would fall. I did not know the gift I gave would become the ground where he decided I was small. But that day had not come yet. In those first months, I was only a proud father. I saw strong walls, true lines, and a son stepping into a future built on family ground. I thought respect, once poured, would set like concrete. I thought love, once planted, would root like neem. I thought a home, once blessed, would keep blessing us back. I was wrong. And the price of that mistake would be measured not in money or bricks, but in a slap that turned the air cold and changed everything I believed about blood, land, and loyalty. It started small, so small that at first I didn't pay much attention to it. After he got married, my son's voice changed when he spoke to me. It wasn't the same warm tone I had heard for years. It was sharper, shorter, like every word to me was an effort. The first time I noticed it was when I stopped by their house with fresh vegetables from my garden. He opened the door, looked at me, and said, "You should call first." I laughed it off, thinking maybe they were busy. His wife appeared behind him, glanced at the bag in my hands, and simply said, "We already bought groceries." No thank you, no smile. It stung, but I told myself young couples have their own way of doing things. I tried visiting less, giving them what I thought was space, but even when I called ahead, the tone never changed. He started speaking to me like I was a burden in my own family. I would sit in their living room, and his wife would stay in the kitchen or on her phone, never once joining the conversation. She made me feel like I was taking up air that belonged to them. I told myself over and over, maybe it's just the stress of a new marriage, maybe it will pass. But deep down, I knew something had shifted, and not for the better. It happened on a Sunday evening, one of those rare times my son actually invited me over for dinner. I remember I was both surprised and cautious. I told myself maybe things were getting better. I even brought a bottle of wine I had been saving for years, the kind my son and I used to drink together when he still lived with me. I arrived right on time, knocked gently, and his wife answered. She gave me a tight smile, the kind that wasn't really a smile, and said, "He's in the kitchen." I stepped inside, took off my jacket, and followed the smell of food. My son was at the stove, stirring a pot, and for a moment I felt a flash of pride. I had taught him to cook when he was a teenager. I said, "Smells good, son," but he just nodded without looking at me. We all sat down to eat a little later. The food was fine, but the air felt thick. His wife barely spoke, just whispered to him a few times, and looked at me like I was sitting in her chair. Halfway through dinner, the conversation shifted to money. My son mentioned the rising costs of maintaining the house and hinted that they might need some help. I told him calmly that I was on a fixed income now and couldn't offer much beyond what I already did, paying the property taxes every year. I reminded him that without me covering those taxes, they could be in trouble. He set his fork down and looked at me in a way I will never forget. His jaw was tight, his eyes cold. "You act like you own this place," he said. I replied, still calm. "Son, the land is in my name. I've been paying the taxes to help you. I'm not acting like I own it. I do own it, and I'm happy to keep helping, but I can't give more than I have." I thought we could talk it out. I thought reason would win. I was wrong. His wife leaned back in her chair, crossed her arms, and smirked. It was the kind of smirk that makes you feel small without a word being spoken. My son's voice got louder. "We don't need lectures. If you can't help, just say so and stop making it sound like we owe you something." I took a breath, trying to stay composed. "I'm not saying you owe me, but I've done everything I can to give you a good life. I worked my whole life to give you this land." That's when it happened. He stood up so suddenly that his chair scraped hard against the floor. Before I could react, he leaned across the table and slapped me across the face. Not hard enough to knock me down, but hard enough for the sound to echo in the room and for the sting to burn deep into my skin. For a second, I couldn't move. My hand instinctively went to my cheek. I looked around the table. His wife didn't gasp, didn't get up, didn't say a word. She just looked at me with that same smirk, like she was watching something she wanted to happen. My son's breathing was heavy, his hands clenched. The silence that followed was worse than the slap itself. It was the kind of silence that told me nothing I had done for him mattered anymore. I swallowed hard, looked down at my plate, and forced myself to eat the rest of the meal, not because I was hungry, but because I refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing me leave in anger. Every bite tasted like ashes in my mouth. My hands shook slightly, but I kept them steady enough not to show weakness. I thought about the years I spent working construction in the rain, in the cold, in the blistering summer heat, all so he could go to school without worrying about bills. I thought about the nights I skipped dinner so he could eat. I thought about the day I handed him the keys to his new home and told him, "This land is yours to build your life on." And now here I was, sitting across from the man I raised, the boy I loved, who had just struck me like I was a stranger who wronged him. When dinner was over, I stood up, put on my jacket, and quietly said, "Thank you for the meal." My voice was steady, but inside, something was breaking apart. He didn't look at me. His wife just kept that same expression, her chin slightly raised as if daring me to say something. I walked to the door, stepped outside, and took in the cold night air. My cheeks still throbbed. I didn't cry. Not there, not in front of their house. But as I walked down the driveway to my car, the reality set in. The boy I had raised was gone. In his place stood a man who had no respect for me, no gratitude, no shame. When I got into my car, I sat there for a long time. I didn't start the engine right away. I just stared at my hands on the steering wheel. Those same hands that had built the frame of his house. Those same hands that had signed the papers giving him the right to live there. Those same hands that had held him as a baby, that had clapped for him at his graduation, that had hugged him when he got married. And now those hands trembled, not from weakness, but from the weight of a decision forming in my mind. That night, when I got home, I stood in my small living room and looked around. The old photos of him on the walls, the framed picture of us fishing, the shot of us standing in front of the house before he moved in, they all felt different now, like they were from someone else's life. I poured myself a glass of water, sat in my chair, and decided something with absolute clarity. I would not let this go. I would not forgive this disrespect, and I would not warn him about what I was going to do next. He thought that land was his. He thought my name on the papers meant nothing. But he was about to learn that when you strike the hand that gave you everything, you risk losing it all. I have been hurt in my life before, but this was different. This was not a stranger's insult, not a fight with a neighbor, not even an argument between two men. This was my own son striking me in my own blood's presence, on land that was mine. That kind of pain does not just sit on the skin. It goes into your chest, into your bones, and it stays there like a cold that will not leave. As I sat there at the dinner table, my cheek still warm from the slap, I could feel every set of eyes in the room. Not from a crowd, but from the two people who mattered in that moment, my son and his wife. Neither one spoke. Neither one apologized. My son's breathing slowed back to normal, and he picked up his fork like nothing had happened. His wife looked down at her plate and began eating again, her lips twitching with that same smirk I had seen earlier, like she had just won something. The sound of silverware against plates was the only thing in the room. It felt louder than it should have, every clink and scrape pressing on my ears. I knew that if I opened my mouth, then my voice would crack, and I would lose the little dignity I still had in that moment. So, I chose silence. I looked at my plate and forced my hand to move, lifting the fork, taking small bites, chewing slowly. The food had no taste, but I swallowed each mouthful like it was my pride I was forcing down. My cheeks still throbbed with each movement, but I kept my face neutral. I would not give them the satisfaction of seeing me flinch. Every now and then, my eyes would drift toward my son. He never looked back at me. It was like I had become invisible at his table. I thought about the way he used to look at me when he was a boy, with trust, with warmth, with pride. That look was gone. In its place was something cold and closed off. And his wife. Her gaze carried something worse than dislike. It carried enjoyment. She wanted to see me small. She wanted me to feel like I had no place here, and she had gotten what she wanted. When the meal finally ended, I stayed seated a moment longer, letting them clear the plates. Not because I wanted to, but because I needed a moment to breathe. I needed to make sure my voice was steady before I spoke. Eventually, I stood, thanked them in a quiet tone, and walked to the door. No one offered to walk me out. No handshake. No hug. No "drive safe, Dad." Just the sound of my footsteps on the tile and the door closing behind me. Outside, the cool night air hit my face, and I felt the sting of the slap all over again. I walked slowly to my car, my mind heavy with thoughts. This was not just about the slap. This was about everything it stood for. The loss of respect, the complete disregard for everything I had done for him, the clear message that I was no longer someone he valued. That night, sitting in my car before starting the engine, I thought about the hundreds of times I had put him first. The birthday parties I worked overtime to pay for. The school trips I covered when his mother said we couldn't afford it. The long days on construction sites where my hands bled just to make sure he had a roof over his head and a safe bed to sleep in. I remembered the day I gave him the land, my pride. It had been in our family for generations. I had told him it was the foundation for his future, that he could build his life there and raise his own children on it one day. I thought it would be a place that kept our family close. Instead, it had become the stage for my public humiliation. I had not just given him land. I had given him the ability to look me in the eye as an equal, to build something of his own. And in return, he had looked me in the eye and struck me down, not with words, but with his hand. Driving home that night, I kept replaying the moment in my head. The way he stood up, the sound of the chair scraping, the heat in his eyes, the crack of his palm against my face. It wasn't just the physical pain. It was the fact that he had done it in front of his wife, without hesitation, without shame. And the worst part was that she had not even been shocked. It was like they had both decided long ago that I was beneath them, and the slap was just the final confirmation. When I got home, I didn't turn on the lights right away. I sat in the dark, my hands resting on my knees, and I let the weight of the night settle over me. My pride felt bruised in a way my cheek never could be. I realized then that something had shifted permanently between us. There would be no going back to how things were. I could not unsee the look in his eyes or the satisfaction in hers. I could not undo the fact that my own blood had humiliated me without a second thought. The humiliation was not loud, it did not shout. It sat quietly in my chest, heavy and cold, and it told me something important. I still had power. My name was still on the land under that house. They had forgotten that. They had gotten so used to living there, so used to me paying the taxes, so used to my quiet presence, that they thought I had no say anymore. But I did. That knowledge began to warm me from the inside, not like comfort, but like a small fire of resolve starting to burn. I decided then and there that I would not tell them what I was going to do. I would let my silence speak. They had taken my dignity that night, but they would lose something much bigger soon. They thought I was powerless. That is what made their arrogance so strong. They believed that just because they had lived on that land for years, it had somehow become theirs. They forgot one thing. The land was never theirs to begin with. It was mine. My name was still on the deed. My signature was still the only one that mattered in the eyes of the law. The house they lived in, the one they decorated, the one they called their home, was nothing without the ground beneath it. And that ground belonged to me. When I first gave my son permission to build there, it was a gift. I didn't hand over ownership. I simply gave my blessing, told him it would always be his safe place, and let him believe it was permanent. But permanent things only exist if you respect the hands that give them. He had forgotten that. His wife had never even known it. I had kept the legal side of things to myself, not because I wanted to control him, but because I trusted him. I thought my son would never need reminding that respect runs both ways. I thought he would never test the limits of my patience. The land was more than just property. It was my family's legacy. My father had worked it. My grandfather had worked it. Every stone, every tree had a memory. I could still point to certain patches of grass and tell you stories from 50 years ago. And yet, here I was, the owner of that legacy, treated like an outsider at a table set on my own soil. The irony was almost bitter enough to laugh at. Almost. As I sat in my chair that night, thinking about the slap and the silence that followed it, a slow realization grew in me. My son thought he had all the power now. He was young, strong, with a wife and a home. I was old, alone, and dependent in his eyes. But power doesn't always look like youth or strength. Sometimes power is a quiet piece of paper locked in a drawer. Sometimes it's the knowledge that with a single signature, you can change someone's entire life. I thought back to the day we started building his house. He had been so excited. I helped lay the foundation myself. I showed him where the land drained best, where the wind would hit least in winter. We dug together, poured concrete together, laughed together. I remember wiping sweat from my face and telling him, "You'll raise your children here. This is solid ground." He had smiled then, grateful. If someone had told me on that day that this same boy would one day strike me on that very land, I would have called them a liar. But here we were. They had forgotten the rules of gratitude. They thought my presence in their lives was optional. They thought my history with the land didn't matter anymore. But the papers in my desk drawer told a different story. I kept those documents in perfect condition, the original deed, my tax receipts, proof of every payment I had ever made to keep that land legally mine. And I kept them not out of distrust, but out of habit. That habit was about to become my greatest weapon. My son never asked about the paperwork. He assumed the land was already his because I let him build on it. His wife never mentioned it either. Maybe she thought they owned it. Maybe she didn't care. But I knew the truth. I knew that without my consent, without my signature, their entire home was just a box sitting on land they had no claim to. And I also knew that the law would be on my side if I ever decided to take it back. The more I thought about it, the more I realized they had been living on borrowed time and borrowed ground. They had mistaken my kindness for weakness. That was their mistake. They believed the story they told themselves, that I was too old to fight back, too sentimental to make a move. But I had built my life on hard decisions. Selling this land would not be the hardest thing I had ever done. Watching them lose it might not even hurt me, not after what they had done. There is a certain strength in silence. After that night, I did not argue. I did not confront him. I did not demand an apology. I simply withdrew. I visited less. I said little when I did. I watched them from a distance, knowing they had no idea the clock had started ticking. Every time I drove away from that property, I reminded myself it was mine to give and mine to take back. People talk about revenge like it's a loud thing, shouting, anger, breaking things. But the most effective revenge is quiet. It's the kind you prepare without them knowing. It's the kind that arrives not with a bang, but with a letter. My son had forgotten that I am a patient man. I had worked decades in construction, where nothing happens fast, where you measure twice and cut once. This would be no different. The power they thought they had was an illusion. They had furniture, walls, and a roof. I had the dirt beneath it all. Without that dirt, they had nothing. And once I decided they would lose it, there would be no turning back. The papers in my drawer became heavier in my mind, not in weight, but in meaning. Every night I imagined what it would feel like to hold that deed one last time before signing it away. I didn't need to raise my voice. I didn't need to tell them my plan. The beauty of holding true power is that you don't have to announce it. You just act. And when you do, the world shifts under the feet of those who thought they were safe. My son had made me feel small at his table. Soon, I would make him feel the same. Not with my hand, but with the ground disappearing from under him. The morning after the slap, I woke up before sunrise. I sat at the kitchen table in my small apartment, a cup of coffee in my hands, and stared at the steam rising. My cheek was no longer red, but the sting was still there, not on my skin, but deep inside. I kept seeing his face. I kept hearing the sound of it. I had raised that hand as a baby, taught him to hold tools with it, taught him to shake hands with it. And now, it had been used against me. That thought alone made my chest tighten. But I wasn't going to spend another day feeling like a victim. That was the last day I would ever sit powerless. I knew exactly what I had to do, and I knew there was no reason to wait. The slap had already drawn a line we could never cross back over. There would be no fixing this with words or apologies. If I stayed silent and let it pass, I'd be telling him it was okay to treat me that way. And worse, I'd be telling myself that I had no worth left. That wasn't going to happen. I had something worth more than his respect. I had the land, and the land was my answer. By 8 a.m., I had called the one man I knew I could trust with something like this. an old friend and lawyer I'd worked with before. His name was Martin. We'd known each other for years, and he wasn't the type to ask unnecessary questions. When I told him I needed to see him in person, he said, "Come right away." No hesitation. I took the original deed from my locked drawer, slid it into a folder, and drove to his office without stopping. When I arrived, he offered me a seat, but I didn't waste time with small talk. I told him the truth, not about the slap, not about the humiliation, but about what I wanted done. "I want to sell the land," I said. He raised an eyebrow, probably because he knew the history behind it, but he didn't argue. He just asked, "Do you have proof of ownership?" I slid the folder across the desk. He looked through the papers, nodded, and said, "You're the sole owner. You can sell it whenever you want." That was all I needed to hear. The next step was to find the right buyer, and fast. I didn't want a family moving in. I didn't want someone sentimental about it. I wanted a developer, someone who would see it as an investment, not a home. That way, there would be no room for my son to negotiate, no space for him to find sympathy from the new owner. This had to be a clean break, ruthless, final. Martin made a few calls that same morning. By noon, he had 3 interested parties. The one that caught my attention was a man from the city who specialized in buying land for cash. No banks, no delays, just a straightforward sale. We arranged to meet that afternoon. I made sure to keep my expression calm when I shook his hand. Inside, my pulse was steady, not from nerves, but from the certainty that this was the right thing to do. We walked the property together later that day. My son wasn't home. He was at work. His wife was there, watching me from the porch with her arms crossed. She didn't ask what I was doing, but her eyes followed me the entire time. I ignored her and kept walking with the buyer, pointing out boundaries, explaining access points. He didn't care about the house. He cared about the location, the size, and the value. By the time we circled back to the driveway, he said, "I'll take it. Full cash offer." That night, I didn't sleep much. Not because I was doubting my choice, I wasn't, but because I kept thinking about the moment my son would find out. I imagined the look on his face when he realized the land wasn't his, when he understood that he had built his life on ground that could vanish with a signature. I thought about the conversation he might have with his wife, the blame, the anger, the disbelief. They would look for someone to point a finger at, and they would find no one but themselves. The next morning, I went back to Martin's office. We went through the legal steps, signed the paperwork, and set a closing date. Everything was done quietly, without a single word to my son. The less he knew, the better. I didn't want confrontation. I wanted the decision to hit him all at once. No warning, no time to prepare. That was the point. I kept my visits to their house short in the days that followed. I smiled when I saw them. I asked how things were going. I even complimented the new plants they had put in the yard. On the surface, nothing had changed. But under that surface, I had already moved the earth beneath their feet. I didn't feel guilty. Guilt is for people who do harm without reason. What I was doing wasn't mindless destruction. It was justice, quiet, personal, and permanent. He had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. This was my way of making sure he understood that. I wasn't going to shout at him or raise my hand in return. I was going to take back what was mine and walk away without looking back. In the evenings, I would sit on my balcony and watch the sun go down. I thought about the day I would finally leave, about packing a single suitcase and disappearing before they even knew I was gone. It gave me a strange peace. Not happiness. I wasn't foolish enough to think this would erase the pain of what he'd done. But peace. And at my age, peace is worth more than anything. I had the plan. I had the power. All that was left now was to see it through. The week of the sale came faster than I expected. Once the papers were ready, the process moved like clockwork. The buyer's lawyer met with Martin in his office to finalize the transfer. I sat there at the end of the long wooden table, the folder of documents in front of me, and listened as they went through each page. There was no tension, no last-minute problem. It was clean. All I had to do was sign my name in a few places. Each signature felt like a hammer hitting a nail. Firm, final, no going back. The man buying the land had no interest in the history behind it. He didn't care that I had given it to my son as a wedding gift years ago. He didn't care that a house now stood there, full of my son's furniture, his family photos, and his life. To him, it was just square footage in a good location. That was exactly the kind of buyer I wanted. The less emotion involved, the better. We weren't building a connection. We were doing business. As I signed the last page, I thought about the day I had stood in that same yard, handing my son the keys to his new home. I remembered the pride in his eyes, the way he had hugged me and said, "I'll never forget this, Dad." I had believed him. I had thought the house would be a place where my grandchildren would grow up, where I'd be welcome at the table any time. That dream was gone now, and as much as that hurt, I had accepted it. The land was mine, and soon it wouldn't be his. The buyer slid a check across the table, a placeholder until the full payment cleared into my account. Martin explained that the rest would be wired within 3 business days. It was a large amount. Enough for me to live comfortably anywhere I wanted. Enough to make sure I never had to depend on anyone again, especially my son. That alone made my chest feel lighter. We shook hands, and the buyer left with his lawyer. Martin stayed back with me for a moment. He didn't say much, just looked me in the eye and said, "You're sure about this?" I nodded. There was nothing to question. I wasn't acting out of impulse. I had spent days thinking about it, and the decision had only grown stronger in my mind. This wasn't revenge for the sake of revenge. It was about closing a door that had already been slammed in my face. The following day, the payment hit my overseas account. I had chosen an international bank for a reason, to keep the money far from any reach my son might have. I checked the balance twice, not because I doubted it was there, but because I wanted to see the proof that the sale was real. The land was no longer mine, the money was. And with that, the control had shifted completely. I didn't go to see the property again after the sale. There was no need. It wasn't mine anymore, and soon it wouldn't be his either. The buyer planned to start development within a month. That meant demolition. The house my son lived in would be reduced to rubble, and every brick would be hauled away like it had never existed. I didn't feel joy at that thought, but I did feel a strange sense of balance. He had taken something from me, my dignity, and now I had taken something from him that he could never replace. During that week, I still saw my son twice. Once when I passed him in the market, and once when I dropped by his house to check in. Both times, I kept my face calm, my tone polite. He didn't suspect a thing. He spoke to me like normal. Well, his version of normal these days, which meant short answers and no warmth. His wife stayed in the background, watching, like she always did. I noticed she didn't look at me with the same smirk she had during the slap. Maybe she sensed something had shifted, or maybe she was just bored. Either way, it didn't matter. The truth was, the most satisfying part wasn't the money, or even the sale itself. It was the knowledge that they had no idea what was coming. They were still living like everything was fine, still walking through that house as if it were theirs. They didn't know that with one letter from the new owner, their whole life there would be over. On the day the sale officially closed, I allowed myself a quiet moment. I sat on my porch that evening, watching the sunset. The sky was streaked with orange and pink, and the air was warm. I thought about my wife, his mother, and how she would have felt about all of this. She had always been the peacekeeper in the family. She would have tried to talk me out of it. She would have said, "Don't burn bridges with your son." But she wasn't here anymore, and the bridge had already been burned by his own hand. I didn't celebrate. I didn't drink or tell anyone. I just sat there and let the reality sink in. The land was gone. The ties were cut. I had done what I needed to do. And for the first time in a long while, I felt like I was standing on solid ground. Ground that was truly mine. I left before the sun came up. The street was quiet. only the sound of a dog barking in the distance and the faint hum of a car somewhere far off. I had packed the night before, one suitcase with clothes, a few personal items, and the important documents Martin had given me. I didn't need much. The rest of my life was going to be lighter, simpler. I locked the door behind me, not because I needed to, but because I wanted the act of turning that key to feel final. I wasn't coming back. The bus station was nearly empty at that hour. I bought a ticket in cash, no questions asked. My destination was a city several hours away, where I'd take a flight overseas. I chose that route on purpose. I didn't want my son or anyone else to know where I was headed. The fewer people who could guess my location, the better. This was not a goodbye trip. This was a vanishing. As I sat on the bus, watching the empty fields pass by, I thought about all the mornings I used to wake up in my old house, the one I had sold to give my son a start in life. Back then, I had imagined we'd be a close family forever, that the land and the house would keep us connected. Now I knew better. Blood alone doesn't keep people close. Respect does. And once that's gone, everything else follows. I didn't call him. I didn't leave a note on his table. I didn't even send a message through anyone else. The last time I saw him, a few days earlier, I'd looked him in the eye and said nothing about what was coming. He had no reason to think anything was different. That was the point. By the time he found out, I would already be gone, too far to reach. My lawyer had strict instructions: deliver the news after I was out of the country. He would hand over the legal notice from the new owner, informing my son that the land beneath his house had been sold. I imagined the moment he read it, the confusion turning to panic, the anger rising in his voice. Maybe he'd call me, maybe he'd curse me, maybe he'd even try to beg, but it wouldn't matter. I wouldn't answer. The flight overseas was long, but I didn't mind. For the first time in months, I felt calm. I didn't have to worry about bumping into him at the market or hearing from neighbors about what he and his wife had been saying behind my back. I was free from the constant reminder of the slap, the smirk, and the silence that followed. Some wounds don't heal if you keep staring at them. You have to walk away. When I landed, I went straight to the small apartment I had arranged to rent. It wasn't big, but it was clean, and it had a view of the sea. I opened the balcony door and let the ocean air fill the room. For a moment, I just stood there, breathing, letting the sound of the waves replace all the noise that had been in my head for months. This was my fresh start. A few days later, Martin emailed me to confirm the notice had been delivered. My son had called his office several times, but Martin didn't give him any details beyond what the paper said. The land was sold. The new owner wanted the property cleared within a set number of days. It wasn't my problem anymore. I didn't check his social media or try to get updates through other people. I didn't need to know how he was handling it. The truth was, this wasn't about watching him suffer. It was about removing myself from a place where I wasn't respected. Still, I knew the reality he was facing: packing up everything, finding a new place to live, explaining to his wife how they had lost the home they thought was theirs. I spent those first weeks in my new country settling into a routine. Morning walks along the beach, afternoon coffee at a small cafe, reading in the evenings with the sound of the waves in the background. The simplicity of it was healing. No tension, no arguments, no cold stares across a dinner table, just quiet. One morning, as I watched the fishermen bringing in their nets, I thought about whether I regretted it. The answer was no. If anything, I wished I had taken control sooner, before the slap, before the years of coldness. People think revenge is about anger, but for me, it wasn't. It was about making sure I wasn't trapped in a life where I was treated like nothing. From where I was now, thousands of miles away, I could see the truth more clearly. I had spent too long giving, always believing that loyalty and gratitude would come in return. It doesn't work that way for everyone. Some people take and keep taking until there's nothing left. And when you finally say, enough, they act like you're the one who betrayed them. I didn't tell anyone in my new town about what happened. To them, I was just an older man who had moved here for the peace and the sea. That was how I liked it. My past was my own, and I intended to keep it that way. The people who needed to know the truth already did. And the one person who would never forget it was my son. In my mind, I could still see the look he gave me that night at the dinner table, the sting on my cheek from his hand, the smirk on his wife's face. That memory was sharp, but it no longer cut. It was just there, like a scar, a reminder of why I had chosen this path. He might still be angry. He might think I was cruel. But I knew the truth. It wasn't cruelty. It was the last act of self-respect I had left. It was Martin who told me how it unfolded after the notice reached my son. By that time, I was already weeks into my new life by the sea, waking up each morning without the weight of that house or those memories on my shoulders. But for my son, the world he thought was solid under his feet had suddenly cracked open. The new owner didn't waste time. He arrived with a copy of the sale agreement, the transfer papers, and a written demand to vacate the property within 30 days. My son's name was nowhere on those documents. His mortgage meant nothing because the house sat on land that was never legally his. Martin said the first call came in less than an hour after the papers were handed over. My son's voice was sharp, angry, demanding an explanation. "How could you do this?" was his opening line, but he didn't wait for an answer because he knew he wouldn't get one from Martin. My lawyer simply told him to read the papers carefully and consult his own legal counsel if he had questions. That's when my son's tone shifted from anger to panic. He asked if the sale could be reversed, if there had been some mistake. Martin's answer was short. No mistake. It was a legal transaction. The second call came later that day, and this time it wasn't to Martin, it was to me. But my phone never rang. I had already changed my number when I moved. He left a voicemail on the old one, probably not realizing it would never reach me. Martin later told me the message was a mix of rage and pleading, the kind of voice that comes from someone who's been backed into a corner and is still trying to punch their way out. But I didn't hear it. I didn't want to. Over the next week, the calls multiplied. He tried emailing me, messaging me on social media, even contacting distant relatives to ask where I was. No one had answers for him, or at least no one was willing to share them. That's the thing about disappearing on your own terms. Once you're gone, you control the silence. He couldn't break it. Meanwhile, the deadline to vacate was ticking away. The new owner wasn't a patient man. He had plans for the land and didn't care about family disputes. My son had to either move the house, which would cost more than it was worth, or leave it behind. I heard through Martin that there were shouting matches between him and his wife late into the night. She wanted to know how this had happened, why he hadn't secured the land years ago. He didn't have a good answer because the truth was simple. He thought I never would. He thought I would just sit there quietly until I was gone, leaving everything to him. When the movers came, neighbors gathered to watch. Some of them had seen the way he treated me over the years. Others were just curious. But I imagine there were whispers, little bits of truth and rumor mixing together in the air. Losing your home in such a public way leaves a mark. It's not just about the walls and the roof. It's about the story people will tell after you're gone. By the end of that month, my son and his wife were living in a rented apartment across town. Smaller, older, nothing like the dream house they had built. He had to drive past the land every so often, seeing it fenced off with heavy machinery tearing at the ground. Whatever memories he had there, good or bad, were being scraped away, replaced by someone else's plans. That's when, according to Martin, the anger started to fade and something else took its place. He called Martin one last time, but his voice was different, quieter, almost tired. He asked if I was healthy, if I was safe. Martin told him I was fine, but gave no details about where I was living. My son didn't push for more. He just said, "Tell him I'm sorry." But Martin didn't pass that message along until much later. I wasn't ready to hear it then, and maybe he knew that. For me, the aftermath wasn't about gloating or revenge. I didn't sit in my new home picturing his struggles. I didn't need to. The point had been made the moment the papers were signed. I had taken back control over something that was mine, something I had given freely and was repaid with humiliation. People say forgiveness is freeing, but so is removing yourself from a place where forgiveness is impossible. I never told the full story to anyone in my new life. When people here ask about my family, I keep it simple. We don't speak, I say, and leave it at that. There's no need for them to know about the slap, the smirk, the long years of disrespect. Those details belong to me and to him. Still, there are moments when I think about what it must have been like for him, standing in the empty shell of that house on moving day, knowing the land under his feet was gone. I wonder if he thought back to the night at the dinner table, if he connected the two events, or if he blamed everything on bad luck. Maybe he still tells himself it was unfair, that I overreacted. But I know better. It wasn't about a single night. It was about years of choices, years of thinking I didn't matter. Now, when I walk the shoreline in the mornings, I sometimes imagine him standing where I used to, looking out at the same horizon. Would he feel peace? Or would the quiet make him think about the words he never said, the respect he never showed? I don't know, and I don't need to. My life is my own again, and that's all that matters. The last thing Martin told me about the situation was this. He finally stopped calling. That was when I knew the aftermath was truly over. No more messages, no more desperate attempts to track me down. He had moved on in his own way, and so had I. But one truth will never change. He hit me on my own land. Now, he'll never stand on it again. Life by the coast is quiet in a way I didn't know I needed. My mornings start with the sound of waves rolling in, steady and calm, washing away the noise of the past. I walk along the shoreline with a cup of coffee in hand, the cool breeze against my face, and I feel a kind of peace I never felt in that house or on that land after my son changed. The air here smells of salt and freedom, not of tension and old grudges. My days are simple. I read books I never had time for before. I visit the small market in town where people greet me with smiles, not demands. No one here knows me as the man who gave away his land, or the father who got slapped by his own son. I'm just another neighbor, another face in the morning crowd. And that anonymity feels like a gift. Sometimes I think about the money from the sale. I didn't spend it all. Most of it sits in a safe account, untouched, because this isn't about buying things. It's about knowing I have the means to live on my terms, without asking anyone for help. I rent a small but comfortable home overlooking the sea. The walls are mine. The keys are mine. No one can tell me to leave. I've made friends here. A retired fisherman named Samuel often joins me for afternoon walks. We don't talk much about the past, just about the tide, the weather, and the way the gulls circle over the water. He's never asked why I moved here, and I've never offered the story. It feels better that way. At night, I sit on the porch and watch the sunset bleed into the horizon. That's when the memories sometimes come back. The slap, the look on my son's wife's face, the way everyone stayed silent. But instead of anger, I feel distance. Those moments belong to another life, one I left behind the day I signed those papers. I know I'll never step foot on that land again, and I'm fine with that. Because the truth is, my son might have built his house there, but I built my life here, far from the disrespect, far from the noise, and far from the people who thought I had no power left. He hit me on my own land. Now, he'll never stand on it again.